Hello, everyone. This is Gary O'Toole from Timeline Astrology. These are my forecasts and predictions for 2023. I'm going to do this a bit differently this year. Instead of showing you the astrology first, I'm going to get straight into my predictions. So it's always a good idea to chant for Ganesh, the Lord of Vedic Astrology. Om Gang Ganapatiye Namah. Just a reminder that I use sidereal calculations, and these are transits. I'm referring only to transits. And although in Indian astrology or Vedic astrology, we pay more attention to what are called dashas, these are the planetary cycles. We also look at sign-based cycles to show how the chart, your birth chart, is coming alive. I cannot show you that here. I can only show you the transits that we're all going to experience in one way or the other. But if you know your dashas, literally your life circumstances, how your chart is already activated, really pay attention, close attention to the planet that is activated. So that's going to have an impact, your dashas, your current time period, your birth chart itself, but also where you live. Where you live is going to have a big impact on how you're going to experience any of these transits. So again, I'm only referring to transits and I'm referring to sidereal calculations throughout. I'm going to show you my predictions for last year, and I haven't altered these in any way. And so see how I did last year, and then show you my predictions for this year, 2023. So 2022, my predictions were, again, I haven't altered this slide in any way. It's the exact same slide. So I got pretty much most of it, correct. But you might say, actually, you didn't need astrology for a lot of these things, granted. And some of these things I actually did predict subsequently and got it right, including the war in Ukraine. But let's look at this. So the first thing is major catastrophic flooding, mass migration. Mass migration, you could say, is an ongoing thing, so that's not a hard call. But I did look at catastrophic flooding, and that is indeed what happened, especially in Pakistan and many other countries, because of simply Jupiter in Pisces, sidereal Pisces conjunct Neptune. I mean, the god of the ocean, right? So that wasn't a hard call, really. Fires, cyber attacks, bombings, natural disasters. I obviously did see war, and I predicted that in the 2022 magazine. I predicted war. Um, Mass protests, demonstrations, some turning violent. Yes, that's indeed happened in many places around the world, including in Iran and many other places. We're going to see more and more of that when you see my predictions for this year and into the future. I'm also going to give you a kind of a broad stroke view of many years to come. Changes in governments, new movements, power to the people. That's going to take more of a hold this year. Power to the people. So let me bring that one up. That's an important one. That's going to take a big hold. Opposition to current leaders, that's also going to take a big hold. Government's controls begin to loosen in spring, summer, massive pushback against restrictions in autumn, winter. Yes, we're seeing that in certain parts of the world. For example, China. And it's worked for them. It's like power to the people. We're seeing that already. It's unbelievable to see that despite the Chinese government cracking down on their people and they protesting it, it turned it around for them. So if the Chinese people can do it, like you can think anyone, anywhere can do it. Any government can be toppled, or at least their policies changed. Bending, breaking the rules, confused about what they are. I mean, this is ongoing, with this whole COVID situation. You go to different countries and you're just not sure of the rules, and you get there and you don't know whether to put on a mask or not half the time. Grassroots movements, subcultures, new projects, ideas. This is a big one, and this is going to continue to be the case in 2023 and beyond. Famines, unfortunately, we have seen that as well. Food shortages, again, saw that. This is all to do with what's happening in Taurus, and especially the Mars retrograde, again, sidereal Taurus. Economic challenges, kind of obvious with Taurus being impacted the way it has been, and hyperinflation, again, just like the flooding, wasn't a hard call. It was down to Jupiter in Pisces conjunct Neptune, and that's why I predicted hyperinflation. So I got most things right so far. The end of the pandemic, becoming endemic, I'm not sure really, and I'm not sure that well, you might say that it is, but that the WHO will not actually state such, because this virus obviously isn't going anywhere, so we just have to wait for them to actually announce something. So my prediction in 2023 is not so positive around that. What I predicted in 2022 was pockets of the virus in certain countries, more restrictions, and we saw that in China, for example. Space race, all of that, Cold War heats up, we're seeing that. Fighting, wars and fighting. So this is where I sort of hinted at this, but when I looked at it closer before Russia actually invaded Ukraine, and I couldn't believe, astrologers weren't saying that that was imminent. Even when they were building up forces along the borders, I wasn't hearing any of the astrologers saying that they were going to invade. And I looked at the chart and I looked at, in particular, Venus retrograde, as it was 8 years before in 2014 when they invaded Crimea. And I thought, well, that's an obvious choice or an obvious prediction to make. And so I did make that prediction. If you're a patron that follows me, you'll have you'd have got that prediction. So basically, yes, I predicted the war in Ukraine. Let's look at how that's going to pan out in 2023 and beyond. That's good news. There is some good news there, I do feel, but possibly good and bad news because it might escalate further before it de-escalates. New drug treatments, might say that's always happening, advancements. I think this is a big one moving forward in 2023, even more so, because of, in particular, Saturn moving into a lunar mansion in Aquarius, where we're going to see a lot of advancements with treatments and drug treatments and all of that. And this one especially, even more in 2023. We've seen it at the end of this year, 2022. By the way, I'm recording this on the 26th of December. Should have noticed that in the beginning. So new workplace innovations, and especially in tech, AI, and virtual reality. AI is blowing up right now as I speak in December of 2022. It's going to blow up in a big way in 2023, but there are also going to be limitations. And we're already actually seeing that. When we get to that, I'll show you more. But we're already seeing limitations of the technology and people literally putting in place limitations already because, for example, ChatGPT, which is basically blowing up everywhere and people are going crazy about it, but they've already had to put in some limitations because of what people were using it for. So that's Saturn in Aquarius, basically. You get the advancement, you're starting to see these new technologies implemented, systems put in place, but then you also get Saturn limiting it. We're going to see a lot more of that. Period of attempting to go back to normal. I don't even know what that means really when I said it, but there's clearly no going back to quote unquote normal. And we're definitely in 2023 going to see advancements. So there's no going back. We're going forward at least. Things are going to progress in ways the last few years could not. So that's positive in that sense. Mask gradually phased out. I mean, yeah, where I am, but I don't know about where you are. And sometimes they're used, in certain conditions. But anyway, a lot of people still use them. You still see that even in countries where they don't use them anymore. Now, this is the one I didn't get quite right for 2022, but I'm still sticking to my guns. And I still feel like, as many astrologers feel like, based on the astrology, that Biden is not going to finish out his term. And I do think 2023, it has even more potential for this. I thought the midterms by the end of 22 would signify his inability to do his job. Of course, I thought more about his inability to do his job anyway, and his cognitive decline, which is quite obvious. But when you look at the American chart, and depending on what time you use, it could stretch even further into 2024 because the cycles in the American birth chart are moving from Saturn to Mercury, and he's just not in the mercurial realm at all. So when you look at his birth chart as well, he's in a Saturn period now. But when Saturn moves into Aquarius, it's impacting him in a big way. And I just don't see Biden, as the months progress in 2023, being able to continue doing the job. But if he does manage to get through 23 into 24, and then as the American chart changes from Saturn to Mercury, he's just not there. And that's one way of predicting for a country's charts and their leader. He is under the domain of Saturn. And so you might say it fits him right now to be, and it fits America right now to have Joe Biden as leader. It doesn't into 2024. So is Kamala Harris going to become leader? Quite possibly, because she is mercurial. She is ruled by Mercury. She's Gemini rising. So we might see Kamala Harris take reins by into 2024, I'll say, maybe by the end of 23 into 2024. Okay, China acts aggressively. This is continuing, unfortunately, and they might even more so towards Taiwan. But that whole region over there, what's going on with the BRICS nations and all of that, we're basically seeing now the, I don't even want to say it, but the thing is, let's just say it. We're in a world war. We're in a world war, and it might take some of the sting out of it for you if you just think we're in a world war and all the fear that might be injected into your mind by World War III, World War III. Think about it. World War One wasn't called World War One at the time. It was years later that they called it World War One. We are, I think, in a world war, but it's just going to be different periods of escalation and de-escalation, and different things we can see are happening. It's all being set up right now. With this divide, with the NATO and all of that, and these BRICS nations. So that's just going to increase, unfortunately, in the next few years in particular, and into the next decade also. Like I said, at the time, this was at the end of 2021. I thought Russia's on the verge of starting a war, but then when I looked at it again in January and made that prediction, it was based on Venus retrograde, amongst other things. So I didn't do too bad. Let's have a look at these predictions for 2023. Okay, there are a lot of changes going on in 23. Lots of changes. And that's both positive and negative, because Aquarius especially, which is really the focal point in many ways with Saturn moving in, shows progression in many ways, but also the unforeseen circumstances and consequences, more especially the consequences because of advancement. And so there's going to be a lot of advancement, a lot of progress in one way, and in another way, there's just not going to be, the consequences aren't going to be thought through. Technological advancements and so on. Healthcare, all of that, major issues. Tech and healthcare are two major things of Aquarius. Okay, so things are going to progress, but it's going to be, and this is maybe the main headline, I could really highlight this one here. Extreme year economically. That's kind of obvious, but I'm going to go much further than that. And I'm going to say that there's going to be a major stock market crash by the end of the year after a really volatile summer. Again, I'm going to hold off on the astrology and look at that later, but I do think it's going to be a really extreme up and down year. And it's going to probably in the summer create this kind of almost inflation is going to continue, I think, for the first quarter, but after April, as Jupiter moves into sidereal Aries and joins the North Node and Uranus, we're going to see like a massive kind of inflationary kind of thing, and it's going to be held in check somewhat by Saturn, but it's probably going to be this sort of boom bust situation going on by the end of the year. And by the end of the year, October, November especially, there's so many markers for a stock market crash that if we don't have it, we're going to have some major spiraling out of control in the economy. Now, if we look at this more positively, it could be just a whole new something being born, a whole new digital currency. I've heard echoes of that online. So we might see a new currency literally to kind of rescue this kind of situation. But it might be, in fact, the digital currency itself that crashes everything. I don't know. Supply chain issues are going to continue. That's kind of obvious, really. But especially the beginning of the year because of Mars and Taurus until it gets out in March at least. Hyperinflation again, stock market crash by the end of the year, especially markets behave erratically, highs and lows. If you're in any way investing in anything in markets, or if you're buying properties is another major issue by the end of the year, but all through the year, really, you really need to have your wits about you, I would say. Major issues around healthcare, travel, and real estate. So real estate, I think, is going to be a major thing as well. I'm going to show you now as well how everything's starting to line up in the summer with Pluto on one side, Mars on the other, and the nodes squaring them. Mars will be in Cancer opposite Pluto. We're going to see some major developments here in terms of the real estate market. Possible house market crash, as I said, but it's again what's happening in the summer that can lead to this situation, and it could be some major adjustments that lead to a crash by October, November. And then this new monetary system, I don't know if it actually crashes the old one or if there's a new centralized digital currency. That's what I'm hearing. I put question marks after the things I'm just not sure about because I'm not an economist, obviously, and I don't really know how these things work. But yeah, is there going to be a completely new financial system? Maybe. This thing is interesting in terms of Saturn in Aquarius. Last time it was here and throughout history, you're seeing these sort of humanitarian movements, basically, and things being implemented. So this kind of concept of a universal basic income, obviously not in all countries, you have to like look at where you are, but in some countries, and even in the country I'm in Ireland, artists are on a test run, a 3-year test run of this sort of universal basic income for those in the arts. So we are seeing it already, but I do think we're going to see more of this at least being talked about as a potential solution. Obviously, political unrest worldwide continues. This is not going anywhere anytime soon. If you're heading into like major escalation in war and world war, we say that, obviously this is going to continue. And I'm predicting, and I have been doing that for quite a while now, major unrest leading to 2025, 26, especially, where there's going to be major revolutions, even in countries you wouldn't expect, like beyond Iran and these kinds of countries that are already seeing revolutions, like major countries, I think, like the US, China, Russia. I think all of those countries are primed for revolution by mid-decade. But what that leads to, I guess I'm very hesitant to make predictions about the following decade and a world war until I see how the revolutions pan out. Let me put it that way. Uprisings continue around the world. Russian regime challenged more and more, leading to the mid-decade period, 25, 26, where the current regime, I think, will end. That's putting it bluntly. That's not a prediction for 23, but by 25, 26, yes, the Russian regime will end. War in Ukraine. Now, this is obviously the most important thing for all the people in Ukraine, but really for the world because of this whole dynamic being set up now. And it has begun. The US is at war with Russia and Ukraine is where they're battling it out. So again, there's going to be an escalation, de-escalation throughout many years, but I do think that there's a potential for a de-escalation or even ceasefires in 2023. That's briefly, I'll tell you, that's because of Saturn moving into Aquarius, aspecting Aries and Scorpio. And the last time it did that 30 years ago, similar things happened. Russia and China de-escalated their arms. There was IRA ceasefires last time Saturn was in Aquarius. Saturn, when it in any way influences Mars's sign, the planet of war, it just tends to de-escalate and create this ceasefire. But potentially after, this is the thing, this is the downside. The US may be drawn into direct conflict, and that will lead to protests because we also saw, for example, Vietnam protests when Saturn was in Aquarius previously. So there could be an escalation initially and then followed by a de-escalation, and it could get as far as this. Now, the reason I'm saying nuclear or chemical warfare possible is because as soon as Saturn moves into Aquarius, though it may aspect Mars' sign, Jupiter in Pisces is kind of let loose then. And that could lead to, again, further inflationary trends and all of that, but also these kind of threats of nuclear and chemical warfare being used, unfortunately. So amongst all of that, China may take advantage of the chaos that ensues in 23 and then attack or threaten to attack Taiwan. That could escalate. It's again escalating and de-escalating over these next few years, I think. So further divisions in the US is down to basically not the transits, but actually, well, somewhat the transits, but more so the cycle that the US chart is undergoing at the moment of the north node of the moon, Rahu. And it's just going to get more and more divided over the next few years. What happens with Biden also might divide it even further. Many leaders worldwide challenge or step down, and this could even lead to, now, I'm putting a question mark after this one. Biden, I mentioned, leaving office, but King Charles abdicating, potential for this in 23, 24. The reason I'm predicting this is obviously Saturn in Aquarius opposite Leo. Leo's all about leaders, and Saturn in Aquarius is going to challenge all leaders, really. All leaders who are not doing the right thing by the people. That's a lot of leaders. But why King Charles? Obviously, Leo is all about royalty also in that sense. But that's actually based more so on the book, the Nostradamus predictions that went to the top of the charts in 2022 after the Queen died. And based on this book, a translation that basically predicted the Queen's death and subsequently predicted Prince Charles abdicating in the year or two after, and then likely Prince William becoming king. And so I looked at the charts and I looked at the potential, and I did see a potential for that in the astrology in 23. So, but still a question mark. Shocking turn of events in the summer. The summer is going to be shocking, and in terms of the war as well. So I can leave that to your imagination, I guess. Major issues with floods and water. Now, you might think, well, God, can it get any worse after 22? Yes, it can, unfortunately, because Jupiter continues in Pisces for the first few months until April. But then also on top of that, we have Saturn moving into Aquarius and then into the lunar mansion, which is ruled by Varuna in the Vedic myth and lore, and that's the god of the ocean. And so Saturn moving into this sign from March could show major issues from like water issues, floods, illnesses from water contamination, subsequently droughts and all of that, record-breaking storms. The last time Saturn was in Aquarius in this particular lunar mansion was the longest recorded hurricane in history in the US. So yes, more floods, more storms. As I speak, of course, there's massive storms and that cyclone that's hitting the US. It's winter. Next winter could be worse, right? More viral outbreaks. Again, that's the potential. The nodes are going to enter their lunar mansions. Ashwini and Swati. The south node is already in Swati. Rahu, the north node, will enter Ashwini. These two lunar mansions are associated with the nodes themselves. So they're like really activating the nodes and viruses in a big way, unfortunately. So a return of, another wave. We're seeing that in China already, but we could also see a new one. Massive AI advancement, huge AI advancement. We saw that already with ChatGPT and all of that, but there's going to be a lot more. The metaverse is going to take a huge leap forward. I think what's happening now, and Apple are going to release their headset, by the way, in 23. I think what's happening now is we're likely to see like major advancements in technology. So that's something I want to say, that it's almost like we could point to 22, 23 as the beginning of something that becomes part of our life in the future. And by the time that Saturn is finished in 30 years' time, we're going to be like, wow, that really started then, and we are living with this now. And it could be the AI thing, that AI chatbots and all of that are going to replace Google searches, for example, and people can just learn whatever they want online and don't even need a teacher. You don't have to scroll for hours through websites trying to get information you want. You can just ask this bot a question and it will tell you the answer. So yeah, I think it's the turning point. Advancements in treatments for disease. This is another more positive thing about Saturn in Aquarius and this lunar mansion called Shatabishak, which literally means 100 healers. So the potential here for more diseases there, but obviously more healers. More healers means more treatments. There will be, of course, though, however, with Saturn always, you're putting a lid on it with Saturn always, and it will basically regulate drug use. And that might include psychedelics and their use, but all kinds of healthcare and drugs and all of that, and new regulations in healthcare, even new healthcare systems. Like previously with Saturn and Aquarius, we saw new healthcare systems in the US, for example. Social media, again, tech leading on from that, new social media platforms, but also regulations on current ones, major societal reforms worldwide, but also problems in societies and communities, addressing problems in societies. That's Saturn in Aquarius. And finally, new grass movements and humanitarian movements. So they're my predictions for 2023. Let's look at the bigger picture here, just to kind of give you a broad stroke view of what I think is going to pan out. When Saturn moves into Aquarius in 23, it leaves Pluto finally. So that's good news, because we've had now since 2020 this sort of doom and gloom expectations with Saturn Pluto. So that's more positive in one way. It's a very strong position for Saturn in Aquarius. So things are going to progress in more positive ways. Again, we won't know the consequences straight away, but there you go. At least we're moving forward with things. But then Saturn enters Pisces by 25 and meets with Neptune. And this is where current systems completely dissolve, including the Russian and Chinese regimes, I think, but also in terms of just all systems like that are now in place, whether it's like restricting you in some way in your life or it's getting you to focus, whatever it might be. This is both positive and negative connotations because Saturn Neptune in Pisces is so confusing, I imagine, for many people that when we have a system in place, we might complain about it, but when it's taken away, we kind of get a bit freaked out. So this is the potential for this mid-decade period when systems start to collapse. We start to freak out because even if it was a really not a great system, there isn't a system. People are going to get really confused. And so there's great potential here, though, to make new systems and to make new systems that suit everybody. But like I said, this is the other downside of it, complete confusion. So Jupiter then, by mid-decade, is going to enter Cancer. And so this is the revolution because this is Jupiter and Cancer exalted. And just like the French Revolution, Jupiter and Cancer, that's when it began. We're having very similar transits to that whole period leading up to the French Revolution. So we're going to see lots of revolutions because you don't have a revolution until you hope for something better. That's Jupiter and Cancer. And the masses of people with the Saturn Neptune dissolution going on and dissolving all things that were, keeping us held back. This is going to lead to major uprisings. So it's going to be confusing as hell, but it's also going to be very hopeful in changes that are being brought about. Then, however, Saturn meets with Uranus the following decade, after having gone through its sign of debilitation in Aries, the sign of war, and then leading to the conjunction of Uranus in Taurus and then Gemini. This is a complete and utter shakeup of the whole world system, new monetary systems, world war likely, because of the kind of crashing of the system and because of the crash of the economic system in particular. I mean, that's why countries go to war, might even see the potential here is of the US dollar, that's been sounded out, rung out throughout the internet right now. But the astrology does point to that with a Pluto return for the US, this kind of complete, I'm not going to say collapse of the US dollar, but like maybe a demotion of it. And all of this creates so much instability that the US then can easily get dragged into or, decide to, get into the war more obviously. And this is where it can really start to escalate in the new decade. And then after, it escalates, then we have a Jupiter, again, Pluto conjunction as we did in 2020. We're going to have another one in 2032 as, this war has taken off. This is where we're going to see the economic fallout because of the war. So the long-term view is not so rosy, but there is an interim period where things look more hopeful and that there could be new systems that consider everyone. And again, that's not going to be in every country. I'm not going to be so naive to think that's the case, but there are going to be certain countries that look after their people and think about, implementing new sort of, whether it's universal basic income systems, I don't know, as monetary systems collapse. It really depends on what country you're in, is what I'm saying. So that's the kind of long-term view. Okay, let's get into the astrology. First of all, let's look at the eclipses. So again, remember sidereal. The total solar eclipse occurs on April 20th at 5 degrees of Aries. There is an annular solar eclipse at 26 degrees of Virgo on October 14th. So these are the major ones to look out for. Solar eclipses generally have, that bigger impact. And then the lunar eclipses, and in this case, partial lunar eclipses, maybe have more immediate impact, maybe not such a long-term impact. So really I would say pay attention to 5 degrees of Aries mark, an opposite in Libra, as well as 26 degrees of Virgo. And these are really getting hammered, I would say, by the end of the year. This is why I'm saying this collapse in October, November, the monetary system, stock market collapse, potentially. But let's look at this in more detail. So this is the total solar eclipse of April 20th at 5 degrees sidereal Aries. It's the lunar mansion Ashwini. It's all about new beginnings. Very shaky new beginnings in 23, of course. The previous new moon in April, on April 21st, we have an exact conjunction between Venus and the North Node Rahu, which is creating this particular eclipse in April. So the monetary system straight away is going through some major volatility, basically. Obviously, this is visible in the Far East and in East Australia, but basically, I think this is going to affect the world markets in a big, big way. So in March as well, Venus will be at this degree, 5 degrees. So again, right from the beginning, really, I would say March, April, we're going to see some major volatile things happening with the markets. And going back to that one, I just think it's important to actually keep an eye on that for yourself. If you have any planets around 5 degrees, if you were born around 20th of April, any planets are 5 degrees or around that or opposite in Libra, keep an eye on that planet and what it represents for you, because it's going to have a big impact in your life. So then there's a partial lunar eclipse a couple of weeks later. It's not as impactful because it's partial, but it's still there. It's impacting 20 degrees of Libra. Vishaka is the lunar mansion there, the scales in Libra on 5th of May. So that's one to note. That's kind of, again, always with the solar eclipse happening first, then the lunar eclipse a couple of weeks later. It's sort of this culmination point with all of the issues that were instigated for the new moon and solar eclipse culminate by the full moon in this partial eclipse. And so there might be some resolution around certain things as well. The fact that it's a sign Libra and it's all about the, balance and economy and all of that and diplomacy. There could be some warlike situations, of course, with the eclipse in Aries in April, but then in May, possibly some resolutions. The next one then happens in autumn. So we have an annular and almost total. It's like when you have the ring around the moon, you have an annular solar eclipse on October 14th at 26 degrees of Virgo. So even though the South Node hasn't made it into Virgo yet, it won't till the end of October into November, at which point it will transit this 26 degree mark in November. This is why this is the crash coming. And so this in Chitra, this is it's divided between Virgo and Libra, and it's basically dividing things out in many ways as well. And that's what Virgo likes to do, and balancing things out and balancing the checkbooks and all of that. There's a lot of imbalances here, put it that way, with an almost total solar eclipse. And you can see how it's splitting America. You can see how that is happening for America and in South America. But wherever it is happening on the planet, it's happening at 26 degrees of Virgo, and that's getting activated in a big way by November, with the South Node here, with Venus conjunct almost exactly by degree this point here at 26 degrees in November. I cannot see that playing out in any other way than a market crash. And if it's not a market crash, I'll be very surprised and I'll eat my hat. And when I do the predictions for 24, I'll bring that up, of course. But if it's not a market crash, I do think it could be, some new monetary system, that comes into the rescue or something. That's maybe a bit naive and maybe too hopeful of me. But anyway, that's the eclipse of October. And then a couple of weeks later, again, we have the same situation with the solar happening first, then the lunar. So it culminates, it reaches this kind of crescendo, and this full moon and partial eclipse in Aries, 10 degrees of Aries eclipsed on the 28th of October. Again, Ashwini, the first lunar mansion in Aries, this kind of impulse, this moving, this starting something new. But in a way, the full moons and eclipses at least resolve certain things. So that's also possible. When we draw this back to the previous eclipse here, which was actually a solar eclipse here, remember, if I go back to the previous eclipse on the 20th of April at 5 degrees of Aries, we could actually say that is starting something in the war situation. And then later on in October, this is sort of a culmination point or a resolution point, let's hope. So that's the eclipses. Let's get on with the astrology and the retrogrades. Pluto is retrograde every year, as is Neptune and Uranus. All these planets retrograde. Mercury retrogrades really almost like 4 times in the year. It's starting the year retrograde, it's finishing the year retrograde. We'll look at that. So first of all, let's look at Pluto. So if you have any planets, of course, between 3 and 6 degrees of sidereal Capricorn, this is where you're experiencing this Pluto retrograde or stationing, especially at 3 or 6 degrees. If you have any planets there, they're going to be impacted. Pluto tends to, bring things up from the depths, from the hidden places, right? So you might say your subconscious. But in the world, that's more kind of secrets being revealed. Now this occurs from May to October, and that's not unusual. Again, it happens every year. But what is unusual, I think, is that because it's the 6 degree mark, it's making it to 6 degrees where it is in the US chart. That's again, I think, the pivotal time in the US in terms of the economy, in terms of war. Those are the two things I'm going to flag for the US, the economy and war. And so from May to October, the war leading to the crash is the kind of prediction there for Pluto. Neptune retrograde from June until December from 3 degrees to 0 degrees. So that first 3 degrees of Pisces being impacted if you have any planets there. The key thing here is that Neptune is now in Pisces and will stay in Pisces. Unlike 22 where it moved in and out, it's going to stay in Pisces, out of Aquarius. And I think that's better because, Neptune in modern day astrology rules Pisces, so it's more at home there. It does create a lot of confusion, but it also creates a lot more idealism. And so at least we're thinking more idealistically anyway. It might be confusing as hell, but like we can see some sort of, again, with maybe things happening in the world that, we couldn't have even dreamt of before, I would say. And again, with the technology and how it's connecting us, I think that's, a positive spin on it. Uranus retrograde from August to January 2024, from 28 degrees back to 24 degrees of Aries. So this is in a way heralding the last time at least Uranus will do this retrograde this far back into Aries, because next year it's going to move into Taurus, sidereal Taurus. And so that's the beginning of the major adjustments economically, of course. But in terms of its transit and its last full retrograde in Aries, because it's not fully done with Aries, right? It's going to go back in and out of Aries next year. But what I would say about it is that because it's Aries, it's the sign of war. And, Uranus moving in here a few years ago, 2016 onwards, we saw major shakeups in the world. It breaks things apart. Uranus and Aries both have in common this kind of independent streak. So Brexit was brought about because of Uranus and Aries. The current war, the current uprisings, the need for freedom, the push for freedom, that's Uranus in Aries. The good news is that Saturn will no longer square this. So we're likely to see more of a push for freedom actually, and governments actually having to get on board with what the people are demanding. So that's also a more positive indication here. Next, we have the other planets. Before we get to Mercury's retrograde, let's look at Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, and Venus in that order, the slower moving planets inward. And so Saturn retrogrades every year, as all of these planets do. June to November, from 13, it's going to make it all the way to 13 degrees of Aquarius, back to 6 degrees of Aquarius. And so that's why, and this 6 degree mark is interesting for both Saturn and Pluto, because the 6 degree mark of a sidereal sign is the 1st degree mark of the tropical sign. So we're seeing major shifts going on in both zodiacs. So if you have anything between those degrees in Aquarius, sidereal Aquarius, make sure you're aware of what that planet is and what it rules for you, especially if it's at 6 degrees or 13 degrees exact, because that's where Saturn is going to stop moving for a whole month, really focusing you on that situation and that issue that you need to address and refocus you, especially as it goes retrograde. And of course, globally, this will mean refocusing on travel, health, healthcare, treatments, all of these things, tech, innovations, how they're being implemented, and do they need to be sort of restructured? All of that is Saturn retrograde in Aquarius. And then Jupiter retrograde, September to December, from 21 degrees of Aries back to 11 degrees of Aries, where it's going to conjoin initially in May, the North Node Rahu, So thinking about that and any kind of connection between Jupiter and Rahu, just as we did back in 2016, it shakes everything up. 2016 was that year, I think what's been now termed the year of rebellion. I think that's what it's being termed. 2023 is going to be that year as well. There's going to be a lot of rebelliousness. And this is even more so because it's Aries. It's the idea that Aries is going to really ramp up the sort of rebelliousness going on in 23. So that's retrograde Jupiter is going to obviously then have to, think about the policies and laws and things. How are we dealing with the big changes, the big shakeups that are happening, and how do we have to, you know, reinstate certain things to kind of keep some sense of order, because there's going to be a lot of disorder and chaos in 23. Whether it's because of the financial situation, most obviously, or in any kind of situation, really, because Jupiter is very much about keeping things together. And Jupiter conjunct Rahu from May, really from April, but especially its exact conjunction in May, and then it's retrograde from the end of the year, behaving retrograde as if it were like Rahu in Aries. It's going to be hard to keep things together, basically. And as things fall apart, whether it's the financial system or whatever it might be, it's very hard to keep order. And that also has connotations in terms of the war situation, of course, because of Aries. So a lot of explosive things going on. Mars retrograde, then, this is the tail end of Mars retrograde, of course, because since October 30th, 22, until January 12th, 23, we have Mars station then direct. So it started to retrograde back in October, 1 degree of Gemini, sidereal, goes back to Taurus. All of these supply chain issues, these resources, these energy supplies, all of that is a problem with Mars retrograde. Mars is energy anyway, but in Taurus, it's supply. Energy and supply are a problem, obviously. The fact that it's stationing in January and then moves forward and moves on in March past its shadow, the point at which it started to go backwards, does show that there's more progress in March. But of course, that means that the whole winter, and of course, that's how it's panning out, the whole winter is, for some people, depending on where you are, a dire situation in terms of energy. Energy and momentum when Mars is retrograde just is not there. It just doesn't go anywhere. Things are not moving forward. And so it's very frustrating. And we're seeing more and more seismic activity of volcanoes on the planet. We're seeing more shootings. These are the kind of things where Mars explodes. And if you keep it in for too long, there's no other way. It has to come out some way. So be mindful of that, especially around beginning of January, I would say. Because then as soon as it goes direct on January 12th, it's kind of more explosive even. It can really want to just vent and let loose, right? Finally, then here we have Venus retrograde from July to September. And this is just, again, another indication of major financial volatility. Because not only is Venus retrograde, I mean, you might say it does it every couple of years, no biggie. But this one is a biggie because it's doing so between the juncture between Cancer and Leo. And this juncture is called Gandanta in Vedic astrology. And it's translated as like ending of a knot. Anta is ending and Gand is like knot. So it's like things are unraveling right now. And things are going to unravel further throughout the summer into the autumn period where I predict that major crash. So it's going to start unraveling pretty quickly though from the summer. And that's because of Venus retrograde. Now think about that, not just in terms of the global economy, in terms of well-being generally as well, because that's Venus. Think about it in terms of diplomacy. That's another major indication of Venus. So, and when you mix this in with everything else that's going on, it just looks like a very volatile year. That's Venus. Finally, then we have Mercury retrograde as it does every year. This time it's doing it almost 4 times a year, starting and ending the year. So really we're having 2023 bookmarked by 2 retrograde periods of Mercury. That obviously means there's a lot of review going on. And with all of the changes and shakeups that are going on in 23, then of course we're going to be doing that a lot. A lot of changes have already happened. We're starting the first Mercury retrograde actually at the tail end of 22, 29th of December until the 18th of January. So really at the beginning of 23 is not going anywhere anytime soon. It's very sort of frustrating potentially because of Mars also retrograde till the 12th of January. So if you kind of think about January more so as a sort of almost like review of what's gone and what needs to happen in the future, and think about more the end of January as a sort of time, especially by the new moon, by the 21st of January, to maybe start afresh, start anew, instead of trying to think about it as the 1st of January as being, the time to start. It's probably not. And even if you do start with an intention, it's really important that you reflect on and review the details around that. That's what Mercury retrograde is all about. It does so from 0 Capricorn, doesn't make it very far into Capricorn, back into 13 degrees of Sagittarius. So think about that area of your chart. Travel would be chaos over the Christmas, and that's panning out. So I would say even into the new year, travel is going to be chaotic. And if you can avoid travel at all, I would do so. The next retrograde then occurs in April, May, end of April to mid-May, 21 to 11 degrees of Aries. And interestingly enough, it's the same section of the zodiac through which Jupiter is transiting, retrograde. So just let me remind you of that. Jupiter, Mercury, 21 to 11 degrees of Aries. So basically, we're going to see this review of many things initially that then becomes a kind of more meaningful review with Jupiter subsequently. And so Mercury is always more kind of logical and rational about things. And it's like, we need to put this in place and that in place, and this doesn't work. So let's redo this and rethink this. And then Jupiter does so in the same section of the zodiac, where it's like, can I connect more to this? And is this purposeful? Is this meaningful to me? This is what I've planned, but now that I'm doing it and I've gone over it, and is it something I can really get on with? Is it something that I can actually be okay with? Is it actually even right to do this? That's the Jupiter afterwards. So that's Mercury retrograde first, so from April to May. And then afterwards, we have Jupiter from September to December. Then the next Mercury retrograde is from August to September, 27 to 13 degrees of Leo. You can see here that it's all the fire signs starting the year in Sagittarius, then Aries, then Leo, then finishing in Sagittarius into Scorpio. So it's all the fiery signs, the sidereal zodiac. So it's very much about, what are we passionate about as well, individually, globally, collectively, thinking about what inspires us. And, it's fiery as well. So we have to think about the war situation, especially April, May. But then in August, September into the autumn, we're looking at, governments and leaders and leadership changes and things like that, especially going on August, September, or at least major reviews going on. And then the year finishes again with a Mercury retrograde from December 13th and until January 2nd of 2024, starting the new year out again with a Mercury retrograde next following year from 14 Sagittarius to 28 degrees of Scorpio. This is highly complicated because this is just like the section for Venus in the summer of 23 between Cancer and Leo. This is a section between Scorpio and Sagittarius, which is also highly volatile. And in terms of mercurial things, again, travel. If we add Saturn into the mix here, and in terms of Saturn's aspect to Scorpio, and what I mentioned about Saturn and storms, I would not be traveling next winter, just as I wouldn't around this period in 2023, beginning of 2023. So I wouldn't travel in the winter of 23, 24, in other words. And if you do have to, and if you're in a part of the world that, is impacted by weather, especially, storms, just be mindful of that, I would say. I want to talk about the Pluto square the nodes. So let me just show you how this looks. And so this top one here is May. Jupiter, first of all, meets with Rahu, but it's squaring Pluto. And Pluto is opposing Mars. This is May. Mars in Cancer is debilitated. Mars in Cancer, debilitated, reacts strongly. Doesn't like being debilitated, of course, so it can overcompensate and lash out. And so this is, this is an issue here in terms of the war situation. Jupiter, North Node, Uranus, Mercury, squaring Pluto, Mars, which are opposing. Yeah, in terms of the war situation, things could really get out of hand here. So this is now further on into August, and this is the exact square, you might say, using the mean node. But basically, this is going for the reason I'm bringing this up is because this is happening from that period of May onwards. We're having this square between the North Node and the South Node in Aries and Libra, and Pluto here in Capricorn. And in this case, the Sun here later on in the summer opposes Pluto. So it's just one thing after another with these squares and oppositions. And basically, it's all pinned here on the war situation in Aries, of course, the impact it has on the economy, the impact it has on governments and systems, and our own sense of just security and safety are going to be impacted by all of this. And this is going to continue throughout the rest of the year until the nodes move out by the end of October into November. So really from April, May until October, November, we're having this square going on. And because Pluto is retrograde throughout this whole period, and Rahu and Ketu both are always retrograde, the mean nodes, they continue to move closely in a square to each other for the rest of the summer. So it's going to create a highly volatile, highly unpredictable, also highly fated sort of set of circumstances throughout the summer into the autumn, where things might feel like out of control. Let me put it that way. So it's important that we do something about that personally, but that we look at what's happening in the world as really what is happening is inevitable. We can't do anything about those things, but we can do something about our reaction to those things for sure. Okay, so let's look at all the new and full moon phases for 2023. And I'll bring up each month and all of the key transits that are occurring around these lunations. So the first month, January, we see the full moon on January 6th in Puravasu in sidereal Gemini. And then we have a new moon in Uttara Ashada, the latter invincible, on January 21st in sidereal Capricorn. And basically, this period, the January 21st new moon, is really the new year. The sun will have moved into Capricorn, that's sidereal Capricorn, and the new moon in Capricorn is a better new start really than the 1st of January, because really the first couple of weeks of January with Mars still retrograde and Mercury continuing to retrograde until January 18th, and that Mercury retrograde opposite that full moon on January 6th, it's not going to feel like a sort of fresh start. You're not like straight out of the gate. So here's the full moon on January 6th, 22 degrees sidereal Gemini, Sun here, 22 Sagittarius, Mercury almost exactly opposite the moon, conjunct the Sun. So it's the midpoint of the retrograde cycle on January 6th. So we're only halfway through the Mercury retrograde cycle. And so again, not really a fresh, clean start for the new year. And it will take some time for us to feel like it's really starting proper. Again, maybe the new moon on the 21st. Mars continues to retrograde in Taurus, and that will station on the 12th. And so really, I wouldn't plan around the new year until this one on the 21st of January. So the moon and the sun conjoin at 7 degrees sidereal Capricorn, quite closely conjunct Pluto. Venus is about to move signs Capricorn to Aquarius, joining Saturn. This is itself a sort of rude awakening, even though it's a new moon and a new start, and Mercury and Mars are both at the same degree now moving forward. Mars aspecting Mercury, therefore. And so things can feel like at least they can move forward now, but they're moving forward with a sort of somber sense with Venus conjunct Saturn and Saturn ruling this new moon. And so we do have to take that into account anytime we're starting something new, beginning of the year, it's the middle of winter, and okay, this is kind of a sober awakening, but at least a new start for sure in January. Then in February we have a full moon in Ashlesha, February 5th at sidereal Cancer, and then a new moon in Shatabishaj, which is getting a lot of attention in 2023 because of Saturn entering here in March. That's the new moon in Shatabishaj on February 20th. So the February 5th, new moon is at 22 degrees Cancer, Sun 22 Capricorn. Mercury still hasn't made it out of Sagittarius, and so it hasn't actually gone beyond its shadow phase. And so we're still not out of this kind of review period in a sense, and Mars won't make it out of its shadow phase until March 2nd. So we're really kind of having to sort of go over, well-worn ground at this point, I suppose. And although it's a full moon in itself, is not a new beginning in that sense. It's a sort of resolution phase. It's a full moon on the 5th of February. And then on the 20th of February, we have a new moon in Shatabishaj. Saturn will move in here very soon. And that will be a theme for the year in a big way. And a new moon in this sign, therefore, in the new lunar phase by the end of February, does show this major shift coming out of the winter months, with Saturn now coming into this sign of the 100 healers, which is literally what that word Shatabishad means. So we're definitely looking at healing. We're definitely looking at potential for more treatments for disease, more technological advancements, like to get your head spinning, I would say. Yeah, some of that. Now, there's more positive things going on right now, because by the end of February, we have Venus in exaltation moving into Pisces along with Neptune and Jupiter. The only thing about this is that I might be like too much of a good thing. You've got an exalted Venus, Jupiter, and Neptune all together in Pisces. So this is quite a nice indication for the coming lunar month. So you can see finally here, Mercury has made it out of Sagittarius, moving into Capricorn. Mars is still moving forward, but hasn't reached that point to which it started, at which it started moving retrograde. So we've still got some time to go before we get out of the Mars sort of shadow phase and start really planning ahead and taking action and moving forward, or at least making it so that our life feels like it's really moving forward into new territory. There's still some old ground to go over. So then in March, this is where we start to really pick up and feel like things are starting. And this is actually the month for the new moon, where we have a lunar new year according to the Vedic calendar. So we have a full moon, March 7th in Purva Falguni in Sidereal Leo. We have a new moon in Uttara Bhadrapada, the latter auspicious steps, on March 21st. So first of all, the full moon in Purva Falguni. Falguni is a fruitful one, Purva former. It's very enjoyable. Usually Purva Falguni, lunar mansion here in Leo, Sidereal Leo, 22, sun at 22 degrees Aquarius. However, we're now talking about a Saturn opposition to the sun, or to the moon, with its conjunction to the sun, and therefore also around this time, end of February into beginning of March, a combustion of Saturn. So what it means really is whatever enjoyments that we are envisioning at this stage, whatever thing we would like to express right now that we would love to do, is curtailed somewhat by Saturn. And in a global context, this could mean governments, feeling the opposition from people, more protests and all of that. Usually when you see Saturn Sun combinations, there's that kind of theme going on anyway, but this full moon especially could highlight that. Venus is exalted though, and again, it's conjunct Jupiter, and Neptune is there. And so that is also at the same time, there's this overindulgence going on throughout this whole period, end of February, beginning of March. Mars has almost made it out of its shadow phase. It's moving forward. It's finally going to get out of its not favorite sign, Taurus, because it feels a bit stuck in the mud there and it's not really getting anywhere fast. So that's a more helpful indication moving into the end of March. And this is the end of March, and this is the new moon and a new lunar year, in fact. And now we have finally Mars move out of its shadow, move into Gemini. We have the new moon in Pisces, as it is every year for this new lunar year, according to the Vedic calendar. This would be the very first degree of Aries tropically, so we can see that as very much a new moon, a new year, new moon. And we also have, interestingly, Venus exactly conjunct the North Node Rahu in Aries. So Jupiter is with the new moon. That's very positive. Mercury isn't so positive, but it's usually hanging around Pisces around the new moon in springtime. So that's nothing unusual, and it's propped up by Jupiter for sure. It really depends on where you're looking at this, from what place on the planet you are looking at it from different perspectives. In a general sense, this is a mixed bag in many ways. I do think that one of the main things to highlight here is what I am predicting for 2023, and that is the economic downturn and the initial economic volatility. And that is, again, further highlighted by Venus conjunct Rahu by exact degree in Aries. So, Pisces, although strong with Jupiter there, Mercury's kind of bringing down the mood somewhat. And Mercury is all about practical life and business and so on, and travel and trade and all of these things. And Mercury and Jupiter and the new moon, it all are basically hemmed in between Saturn and Rahu. So Saturn's on one side in Aquarius, Rahu on the other side in Aries. And so this new moon is definitely hemmed in. And what does that mean for the new lunar month, but also the whole year ahead from March 2023? It means that we might feel like we can't go forward, but we can't go back. We're going forward now to some extent because of Saturn into Aquarius, for sure. There's definitely things progressing here. But there's also a theme of, being in limbo in many ways, because there's so much that is potential now possible and we're moving forward. But at the same time, there's so much that is not possible. And we're kind of feeling that hemmed in effect. So whatever ideal situation that you have going on in your own life, in a general sense, I think there's this sense of having to kind of negotiate this situation, being kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place kind of thing. So there are potentials, though, there are positive potentials here, but we just have to be mindful of the pitfalls. And again, the economy is the most obvious expression, I feel, of this, and especially that Venus conjunct Rahu. It's, I think, going to be very volatile for the year. So anyway, that is the new moon and new lunar year in March. Then in April, we have a full moon in Hasta in sidereal Virgo and a new moon. And now we're getting into the eclipses already because it's a new moon in Ashwini, the first lunar mansion in sidereal Aries. Obviously, the sun and moon coming together. That means the sun is now in the domain of Rahu, the north node, and it's an eclipse, and it's a total eclipse, so it's going to be quite close. So let's look at these. This is a full moon. This is at 21 degrees sidereal Virgo, opposite Jupiter and the sun Neptune. There's some nice things about this for sure. Again, we have that hemming in though of Saturn and Rahu on either side of Pisces, so we have to be mindful of that. And whatever dreams, whatever aspirations we have, might feel that. Venus hasn't quite made it out of Aries. It's about to. And it, of course, is ruled by Mars, which is in Gemini, and Mercury, which is in Aries. So Mars and Gemini and Mercury are exchanging signs for this full moon and throughout this period with Mercury and Aries. So there's, potential complications here, but there's negotiations also that are possible for sure. This is the full moon on April 6th. Then on April 20th, there's quite a lot changing at this point because Jupiter is about to move into Aries. You can see here it's at the very last degree of sidereal Pisces. So this is a new moon, but not only that, it's an eclipse and it's a total solar eclipse. So this eclipse is going to shake things up in a big way. And also the next one is 6 months' time in October is going to shake things up in Virgo, opposite. It's at the very end of Virgo. This obviously is in relation more to the war situation in Aries. Mars itself is still in Gemini. Mercury is still in Aries. There is an exchange there for this new moon. And so negotiations, perhaps, forced negotiation, perhaps. Mars, as it aspects this new moon, Aries and Scorpio, Mars' signs, the planet of war, it could show the potential for some ceasefire, forced negotiations, in other words, things like that. But certainly it's like we're at a pivot point now, I think, at this point in April, by the end of April, as Jupiter is about to shift for this new moon. And because it's not quite there yet, it's in between the two signs, it's, uncertain. There's a lot of uncertainty around these changes. This new moon in Aries conjoined Rahu, the north node, and Uranus there, and Mercury, and exchanging with Mars. We're going to see, despite the strengths of Jupiter, despite the strengths of Venus, either side of this new moon, yeah, it's still quite uncertain at this point, but still there are strengths for sure. May, then, we're really getting into the changes. So there's a full moon in Swati in sidereal Libra on May 5th. That is a partial lunar eclipse a couple of weeks after the solar. And then there's a new moon in Kritika in sidereal Taurus, an exalted new moon on May 19th, which we'll look at. So at this stage now, May 5th, a full moon, 20 degrees of Libra, conjunct Ketu. So it's an eclipse, partial eclipse though, and the sun 20 Aries with Mercury now having retrograde in Aries. So Mercury retrogrades in all the fire signs in the sidereal zodiac 2023. So we're going to see this kind of, again, this repeat in a way of the beginning of the year with the full moon in January, with this full moon in May, opposite a Mercury retrograde, this time in Aries instead of Sagittarius. But certainly this sense of not being very clear what is like inspiring us to move forward, and maybe not feeling like we're able to move forward, and figuring out some of the details here and not being clear about them. On top of that, Jupiter is now in Aries, mixed up in all of this with Rahu. And anytime Jupiter and Rahu come together, like the last time they came together was 2016, and that was the year of the rebellion. It's like everything was shook up then. This is now the beginning of another rebellion. This is like everything been shook up, everything sort of, maybe even shocking events happening at this time that we cannot figure out. It's a full moon, it's an eclipse, it's confusing. Something has started here, or there's something that's kind of coming to a head, shall we say. Mars is still in Gemini the whole time, still exchanging with Aries, because Mercury is still, in Aries. It's retrograde now. It makes it even more complicated. So this full moon is certainly complex. So that's the full moon. Then the new moon on the 19th of May, 4 degrees of Taurus, almost exactly exalted. It's a powerful new moon in that sense. And, prior to this, we had the sun exalted and the moon exalted. So that itself is a more auspicious time, I would say, despite, the eclipses, despite the uncertainties and all of the things that are happening. There are new beginnings, at least. Jupiter is in the first sign, Aries. Jupiter is bringing new hope and new opportunity and optimism, despite the sort of what the hell is going on kind of thing at this stage. Mercury now, by this new moon, is starting to move forward. The sun and moon come together in Taurus, while Venus is in Gemini. Mercury still in Aries, but it's no longer exchanging with Mars. But now Mars has slipped into Cancer, where it's debilitated, and opposite Pluto, almost by degree for this full moon. So this is where there are complex dynamics going on here. And I'm almost feel like I'm using that word complex and volatile too much, but I don't know if you can use it too much for the year, because it is highly volatile and highly complex. One of the complexities about this is that Pluto opposite Mars are in a square to the nodes, almost exact by degree. And because Pluto is now retrograde and Rahu Ketu are always retrograde, they now start moving back towards the beginning of Aries and Capricorn in a square for pretty much the rest of the year. So from the summer onwards, we're seeing a lot of volatility and this uncertainty around what seems to be, I'd say, a lot of changes that feel fated and out of control. So it's important to keep perspective at this time, especially around this new moon and this whole period, really, April, May, throughout the whole summer, really, from now on, of this kind of square, Pluto nodal square, and Mars getting involved here, and then Mars later in the year getting involved here in Libra. It just shows that's a lot of the wheels turning, and it's kind of like it's already set in motion. There's nothing we can do about it. Well, we can do one thing about it, and that's become more conscious and aware of our reactions to what's going on right now. Getting into June, we're getting into the summer now and really heating things up, and we're still having the Mars in Cancer, so that complicates things throughout June as well. But here we go with full moon in Jeshta in sidereal Scorpio. This is now a full moon debilitated, as opposed to the last lunation new moon exalted. We have a full moon debilitated on June 4th. And then we have a new moon in Mrigashirsha, the lunar mansion, at the very end of Taurus into the beginning of Gemini. So this one is actually occurring in Gemini, sidereal Gemini, on June 18th. So here's June 4th, a full moon debilitated in Scorpio with Mars itself debilitated in Cancer. So this is in one way a positive thing, because it means that because they're exchanging signs, it's a cancellation of this weakness. So you imagine that Mars is actually moving back to Scorpio and the moon moving into Cancer. So it's a bit more positive than it would have been otherwise, except it's still complicated because of Mars's weakness and the moon. And so it's not a complete cancellation of the weakness, it's a mitigation. And we might mitigate it through different means. Personally, we might see some negotiations again. But I do think the complexity of Pluto opposing now Venus as well as Mars, and the square to the nodes with the full moon in Scorpio, is a volatile period. There's just no denying that one, I don't think. And Rahu and Jupiter have come together by exact degree throughout May, now into June. Yeah, things are being really shaken up right now. The 18th of June is the new moon at 2 degrees sidereal Gemini. Mercury itself is in Taurus. And Jupiter and Rahu and Uranus continue their dance together in Aries, while Mars continues in Cancer. And so, we're having that kind of having to deal with the whole June period, May, June, that volatility of Mars in Cancer, really, and the warlike situations going on, continuing to go on, unfortunately. So then in July, we have a full moon in Purva Ashada, the former invincible one, and that's on July 3rd, and then a new moon, Punarvasu, just as we had the full moon here in January in the return of the light, it's called Punarvasu. So July 3rd, full moon, 17 degrees of Sagittarius. Opposite Mercury, but this time, thankfully, Mercury isn't retrograde, so things are moving forward for this particular full moon at any rate. Jupiter is continuing to move through Aries aspects this full moon also. That's also a more positive indication here. And Mars is finally out of Cancer. It's now, however, opposing Saturn. And, that's a whole lot of complexity. But really, when we have any opposition between Leo and Aquarius anyway, and any planets lining up, but especially Mars and Saturn, there's going to be some conflict in the world. So we're likely to see a lot of conflict in the summer months. And later on, we're going to see Venus retrograde opposite Saturn and then go back into Cancer. So a lot of complexity building here into the summer months. July 17th, we're going to see this start to form. Mars is still in Leo, joined by Venus, but Venus will stop moving soon and start moving backwards. Venus will retrograde from July 23rd, so quite soon. And so we still have an exact square now again between Rahu and Pluto and Ketu, and opposite now we have the Sun opposite Pluto. So it's this kind of turning of the wheel, like fated events feel like out of control, things that are just volatile right now, and just again feel like they're just fated, and you have to just go with it and do the best you can with these things, right? But it definitely feels like things are turning in ways that we have no control over. Then into August, we have two full moons. First of all, we have the 1st of August is a full moon in Shravana. This is in sidereal Capricorn. And then we have a new moon on 16th of August in Ashlesha in Cancer, and then full moon again in Shatabishaj, which is that really emphasized lunar mansion in Aquarius on the 31st of August. So let's show you first the full moon here in Shravana in Capricorn. Again, we're just seeing this, and now even more so, maybe this is kind of like a culmination point. This is really like culminating in something intense because of Pluto squaring Rahu Ketu, and now the Sun Moon opposite for the full moon involved with that. And on top of that, we have the Venus retrograde throughout this period. So there are things that we have to work out now that, again, we have to kind of accept the wheel of fate, the wheel of fortune. Then the new moon on the 16th of August, it's in Cancer, but the very last degree. And this is what's highly volatile about August in general, is that Venus has gone back over second time between Cancer and Leo, retrograde this time, while the new moon is at the very last degree of Cancer. This is where I think the economy is going to start going into like turbulence, major turbulence. Saturn is retrograde at the time. Mars is still opposite. Mercury is now opposite. And again, the continued square between the nodes and Pluto. And then finally, the full moon at the very end, the 31st of August, conjunct Saturn, Venus still retrograde, Mercury now also retrograde, opposite Saturn, again, the square with Pluto and the nodes, and opposition with Venus. It's screaming volatile markets, volatile economy the whole time. And then into September. So the new moon is in Uttara Phalguni, the latter fruitful one. That is sidereal Leo moving into Virgo. It's at the very end of Leo. September 15th, new moon, full moon on September 29th, Uttara Bhadrapada, latter auspicious steps in Pisces. So the new moon, September 15th. This is the new moon. This is still retrograde Mercury and opposite retrograde Saturn. And Mars is now into Virgo and it's getting closer to Ketu. And this is where the major volatility starts to kick in. Venus has started moving direct again, but the turbulence of the whole summer period is going to lead to this kind of crash I'm seeing here into October, November. Jupiter now is retrograde, also aspected by Saturn, still going along with Rahu for the ride, and been taken for a ride maybe also. So there's just a lot of changes. 29th of September, full moon in Pisces, Mars 27 degrees. This mark is pretty much around the eclipse of October, so we're already heading into that sort of things are being shook here in the markets. Housing markets, stock markets, you name it. I think it's going to go through a lot of volatility now. And so let's get to that in October, where it really starts to kick in for an eclipse. So we have a new moon in Chitra. This is the lunar mansion sidereal Virgo, October 14th. It's an annular solar eclipse, almost a total eclipse of the sun. And then 2 weeks later, we have a full moon in Ashwini, the beginning of the zodiac, October 28th, a partial lunar eclipse. This is the 14th. This is the solar eclipse, 26 degrees of Virgo. Mars has already moved over this point in September. So in October, it's already activated it. So then when it joins Ketu by the end of or beginning of October, even before this new moon and eclipse, I think we're going to have a fallout. We're going to have a major stock market issue going on here. Venus has gone over again, the juncture between Cancer and Leo. It's opposite Saturn now, so that just further points to restrictions, restraint, economic restraints. Saturn continues to aspect Jupiter, which is now retrograde, so on and so on, and now opposite Mars. So it's just economically, I think, really highly volatile, this whole Mercury or this whole October period. 20th of October, then the lunar eclipse, partial lunar eclipse, 10 degrees of Aries. Rahu, Ketu have almost made it out of the sign now, but the sun is exactly at its degree of debilitation, 10 degrees, almost 11 degrees. So it's debilitated 10 degrees of Libra. It's in its weakest point. Venus is about to move into its debilitation as well. Mercury and Mars are exactly conjunct opposite the moon, with Jupiter and Uranus retrograde and Rahu. It's all squaring this Pluto as well. So it's just like one thing after another in 2023, economically at least. November then is really where I think the bottom falls out, because the new moon in Vishaka, November 13th, the full moon in Rohini, November 27th. If I show you the lineup here, we have Venus in debilitation, and we'll conjoin Ketu by November. So let's just go back to this new moon first of all. It's the debilitated sun, as it was for the previous full moon, but now it's a new moon with sun and moon 26 degrees, very closely conjunct Mars, opposite Uranus, and a retrograde Uranus and Jupiter. So obviously volatile. One thing to note is that the nodes have moved into Pisces and Virgo, but in another way, that's kind of like, taking the heat off Aries in one way, and Libra and all of that, and the, diplomacy that, well, what diplomacy? And then we're going to see Ketu conjoin Venus by exact degree. And so that's going to be in November, a time, well, I'm just thinking, if that's not a stock market crash, I don't know what is. It's where Venus, if I show you the full moon, and this is the full moon, exactly conjunct Ketu at its exact degree of debilitation. So a full moon with this kind of signature, although exalted full moon, opposite Mars, and this is, and the full moon, of course, rules, the moon is in Taurus, which is Venus's sign. Venus is weak, really weak, and conjunct the south node. Yeah, and Mercury itself has just moved over Scorpio, Sagittarius, and we'll go back over here into the new year, 2024, January 2024. I just don't see this as playing out in any way smoothly at all. Like this just, it seems to me to be like a crash. and the possibly the after effects of a crash that's already happened at this point by the end of November. Last one then is December. New moon in Jeshta, December 12th. This is sidereal Scorpio. Again, debilitated moon, but this time, it's a new moon. It's a dark moon and debilitated moon. So it's weak for sure. And then there's a full moon in Ardra on December 27th in sidereal Gemini. So this is the 12th of December, a new moon, 26 degrees of Scorpio. This is where Mercury will return to in January. Well, roughly it moves back to 28 degrees. So there's a lot to work out here in the aftermath really of this, what I think will be a crash. I really hope I'm wrong about that, but I don't see any other way about it. And then finally, to end the year, a full moon on the 27th of December. Mars is moving through Scorpio, nearly done. Mercury is about to move back, and they're going to meet each other at this threshold. This threshold at the end of the year into the new year, 2024, where Mars and Mercury between Scorpio and Sag. It's like, let me put it this way. Though all might seem lost, it's not lost. And I think we all need to kind of slip out of this sort of doom and gloom situation here, whether it's the economy, whether it's the war, whether it's wars, whatever it is for you personally. I think there's a lot to kind of work out in 2023 that, considering as well that the year is bookended by these two Mercury retrogrades in Sagittarius, we're going to have to really feel like we need something within ourselves to inspire us, that we're not going to find it in the world out there. It's just not there to be seen, or there's not enough of it, not enough inspiration to really pull us through. So we're going to have to dig deep, I think, for this. And this is a period, especially by the end of the year 2023, December, and this full moon, that we're going to have to dig really deep, I would say. And if we do that, though, I think we can come out of this and really come out with something new, and I do think that something new has to be brought about in 2023 financially. I mean, I think the key thing about 2023 is the financial situation, which is, I guess, no surprise, right? So there are the new nations for 2023. If you'd like to join me as a patron, please go to timelineastrology.com or patreon.com/timelineastrology. I'd really appreciate any likes on this video, and also subscribe if you want to see more content. If you become a patron, of course, you get up-to-date content all the time, daily content. I write daily posts for patrons. I do monthly forecasts like this video format, and I do sign by sign, and I do a whole lot more presentations and so on. Any thoughts or questions? I always will love to hear your thoughts. So leave a comment, leave a question. I'd love to hear from you, and wish you all the very best for 2023. And until next time.